Have you ever noticed how some decisions feel completely certain in the moment, only to become questions later? A person can spend days, weeks, or even months convincing themselves they are making the right choice. They weigh the options, analyze the situation, and tell themselves they understand exactly what needs to happen. Yet sometimes, long after the decision is made, life begins revealing pieces of the story that were impossible to see at the time. That is exactly where someone connected to you finds themselves right now. They once believed they had everything figured out. They believed the choice they made regarding you was the logical path forward. They trusted their reasoning, followed what seemed practical, and pushed aside any lingering doubts that tried to get their attention. At first, everything appeared to confirm they had done the right thing. They focused on moving ahead. They stayed busy with responsibilities, goals, and the routines of everyday life. Whenever thoughts about the situation surfaced, they quickly reminded themselves why the decision made sense. They repeated the same explanations so often that they eventually stopped questioning them. On the surface, it seemed like the chapter had been settled, but beneath that confidence, something else quietly remained. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was simply a feeling that never completely disappeared. Every now and then, a thought would surface unexpectedly. A memory would return at an inconvenient moment. A question they thought had already been answered would suddenly appear in their mind again. At first, they dismissed these moments. They assumed they were normal. After all, everyone reflects on past decisions from time to time. Yet as time continued moving forward, those reflections became harder to ignore. What started as occasional thoughts slowly developed into something deeper. The certainty they once felt began showing small cracks. The confidence that carried them through the decision no longer felt as solid as it once did. And for reasons they could not fully explain, they found themselves returning to the same question again and again. What if the choice they made about you was not as clear-cut as they once believed? What began as a passing doubt was slowly becoming something impossible to overlook. And listen to this, because what started as a small doubt did not stay small for very long. The person connected to you genuinely believed they had moved beyond the decision they made. They thought enough time had passed. They thought they had already processed everything. Most importantly, they thought they had accepted the outcome. But there is a difference between accepting a decision and understanding its full impact. And slowly, they began realizing that the impact of their choice was much greater than they originally imagined. At first, the regret appeared in subtle ways. It was not a dramatic realization that happened overnight. Instead, it showed up through quiet moments of reflection. A memory would surface unexpectedly. A familiar thought would enter their mind when they were focused on something completely unrelated. Certain experiences would remind them of you without warning. Each moment seemed insignificant on its own, but together they created a pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore. What confused them most was that they had spent so much time defending their decision. Whenever doubts appeared in the past, they immediately reminded themselves why they made the choice. They repeated the reasons. They focused on the circumstances. They told themselves that everything happened for a reason. And for a while, those explanations seemed enough. But now something was changing. Those same explanations no longer brought the same sense of certainty. Instead of answering their questions, they seemed to create new ones. As the days passed, they found themselves revisiting memories they had not thought about in a long time. Certain conversations suddenly carried new meaning. Certain moments appeared different when viewed through the lens of time and experience. Things they once overlooked now stood out clearly. Things they once dismissed now felt important. It was as though distance had given them a perspective they simply did not have when the decision was made. And listen to this, because this is where the regret started becoming impossible to hide. They began wondering about possibilities. What would have happened if they had chosen differently? What if fear had not influenced their judgment? What if they had given the connection more time, more trust, or more understanding? These questions were uncomfortable because they had no clear answers. Yet the questions continued appearing anyway. The more they reflected, the more they realized their regret was not necessarily about the specific choice itself. It was about what the choice represented. It represented opportunities left unexplored, feelings left unspoken, possibilities they never allowed themselves to fully understand. For years, they believed the decision brought closure. Now they were beginning to wonder whether it only postponed a deeper realization. What made this experience even more emotional was recognizing that the connection had never completely disappeared from their thoughts. Even during periods when life felt busy and distracting, there was always a part of them that remembered, a part of them that remained curious, a part of them that quietly questioned whether they truly made the right decision. They ignored that voice for a long time because it was easier than confronting what it might mean. But now that voice was becoming louder. Every reminder, every memory, every moment of reflection seemed to point toward the same truth. The choice they made had affected them more deeply than they ever admitted. What they once viewed as a closed chapter was beginning to feel unfinished. And the more honestly they examined their feelings, the more they started realizing something unsettling. They may have understood why they made the decision back then, but they were no longer sure they understood whether it was the right one. That realization marked the beginning of a much deeper emotional journey, one that would force them to confront truths they had been avoiding for far too long. And listen to this, because after spending so much time questioning the decision, the person connected to you eventually reached a point where they could no longer focus only on the choice itself. Their attention shifted toward something much deeper. They started asking themselves why they had made that decision in the first place. What emotions were influencing them at the time? What fears were they trying to avoid? What truths were they unwilling to face? These questions were uncomfortable because they forced them to look beyond the explanations they had relied on for so long. For years, they defended their choice with logic. They told themselves it was practical. They told themselves it was necessary. They convinced themselves it was the safest option available. Whenever regret appeared, they responded with reasons. Whenever doubt surfaced, they responded with explanations. But now, after so much reflection, they began noticing something important. Many of those explanations were built on fear rather than certainty. They were created to protect themselves from vulnerability, uncertainty, and emotional risk. At the time, choosing distance seemed easier than confronting difficult feelings. Walking away seemed easier than exploring possibilities that had no guarantees. Convincing themselves they were making the right choice felt safer than admitting they did not fully understand what they were feeling. So they followed the path that appeared most predictable. They chose what felt manageable. They chose what seemed logical. Yet now, looking back, they could see that logic was only part of the story. And listen to this, because this realization hit them harder than they expected. The regret they were experiencing was not simply about wishing they had made a different decision. It was about realizing they never gave themselves the opportunity to fully understand what the connection meant before making that decision. They acted before exploring certain emotions. They reached conclusions before asking certain questions. They moved forward while important truths remained buried beneath the surface. The more they reflected, the more they recognized how much effort had gone into avoiding those truths. Every time they felt something meaningful, they found a way to rationalize it. Every time emotions became intense, they reminded themselves why maintaining distance made sense. Every time their heart suggested one thing, their mind quickly presented a counter-argument. Over time, this became a habit. Eventually, they became so skilled at dismissing their feelings that they almost convinced themselves those feelings no longer existed. But the conversation inside their own mind was changing now. The emotional walls they built years ago were no longer holding the same power. Memories continued returning. Questions continued surfacing. Feelings they thought were gone kept making themselves known. The more they tried to deny the emotional reality, the more obvious it became. The connection had mattered far more than they ever allowed themselves to admit. What surprised them most was realizing that the regret was not growing because they were stuck in the past. It was growing because they were finally seeing the past clearly. They were no longer looking at the situation through fear, pride, or self-protection. They were looking at it through honesty. And honesty revealed things they had been unable to see before. It revealed how much the connection influenced them. It revealed how deeply it affected their personal growth. Most importantly, it revealed how much of their regret came from never allowing themselves to be fully truthful about what they felt. And listen to this, because this is where everything began shifting. For the first time, they stopped asking whether the choice was right or wrong and started asking a more important question. Did the decision truly protect them, or did it cost them something valuable? The answer was becoming harder to avoid with every passing day. Because beneath all the reasons, explanations, and justifications, one truth continued rising to the surface. The connection meant more to them than they ever admitted, and the regret they were carrying was forcing them to finally face that reality. And listen to this, because there comes a moment when a person runs out of excuses. A moment when every explanation they have relied on begins to lose its power. A moment when the truth becomes so obvious that avoiding it requires more energy than accepting it. That is exactly where the person connected to you finds themselves now. After months, perhaps even years, of defending the choice they made, they have finally reached a point where honesty feels unavoidable. The regret they have been carrying is no longer something they can push aside with logic or distract themselves away from. It has become a mirror, forcing them to look directly at what they have been trying not to see. What changed everything was not a dramatic event. It was perspective. Time gave them distance, and distance gave them clarity. Looking back now, they can see details they completely missed when the decision was made. They can see how much fear influenced their thinking. They can see how many assumptions they treated as facts. They can see how often they focused on what could go wrong instead of what could go right. Most importantly, they can see that the choice was not made from a place of complete understanding. It was made from a place of uncertainty. For a long time, they believed regret was something to avoid. They viewed it as proof that a mistake had been made. But now they are beginning to understand regret differently. Regret is not always punishment. Sometimes regret is a teacher. Sometimes it appears because there is a lesson that still needs to be learned. And the lesson they are learning now is one they resisted for a very long time. They are finally acknowledging how significant the connection truly was. And listen to this, because this realization has been impossible to ignore. They spent years focusing on the decision itself, but now they are focusing on what the decision cost them emotionally. They are realizing that when they walked away from the situation, they were not only leaving behind uncertainty, they were also leaving behind possibilities. Possibilities they never gave a chance to unfold. Possibilities they dismissed before fully understanding their value. The more they reflect on this, the more they recognize that their regret is rooted in something deeper than circumstances. It is rooted in the realization that fear may have influenced a choice that deserved more trust. As this understanding grows, something unexpected begins happening. The regret starts transforming into awareness. Instead of constantly replaying the decision, they begin paying attention to what it reveals about them. They see how often they chose safety over vulnerability. They see how often they protected themselves from emotional risk. They see how many opportunities in life have been influenced by the same pattern. Suddenly, the situation becomes about more than one choice. It becomes about personal growth, self-awareness, and understanding the habits that shaped important moments in their life. The truth they are finally admitting is not complicated. It is simply difficult. They are admitting that the connection mattered far more than they allowed themselves to believe. They are admitting that certain feelings never completely disappeared. They are admitting that the decision they once defended so confidently no longer feels as certain as it once did. And with that admission comes a surprising sense of relief, because for the first time they are no longer fighting reality. They are no longer forcing themselves to believe something that does not align with what they feel. And listen to this, because once that truth is accepted, everything starts making sense. The recurring thoughts, the memories that refuse to fade, the regret that keeps resurfacing, all of it points toward the same lesson. The choice they made was important because the connection was important. And now that they finally understand that, they are discovering one last truth hidden inside all this regret. The reason they cannot ignore it anymore is because it has been trying to teach them something valuable all along, something they are only now ready to understand. And listen to this, because after all the reflection, all the questioning, and all the attempts to understand what went wrong, the person connected to you has finally reached the realization that changes everything. The regret they have been carrying is not fading with time. In fact, it has become clearer. And that clarity is forcing them to acknowledge something they have resisted for far too long. The choice they made about you mattered because you mattered. That is the truth sitting at the center of everything they have been feeling. And no matter how hard they tried to avoid it, they can no longer pretend otherwise. For a long time, they hoped the regret would simply disappear. They believed enough time would eventually silence the questions. They thought life would become busy enough to distract them. They assumed new experiences would replace old reflections. Yet despite all of that, the same thoughts continued returning. The same memories continued surfacing. The same questions continued demanding answers. What they are finally beginning to understand is that regret does not remain when something is meaningless. Regret remains when there is something important that still needs to be understood. As they look back now, they can see how much they underestimated the connection. At the time, they focused on circumstances, timing, and practical concerns. They convinced themselves that making the decision was the mature thing to do. But maturity is not always about choosing the safest path. Sometimes maturity is about being honest enough to recognize what truly matters. That is the lesson they are learning now. They are realizing that they spent so much energy protecting themselves from uncertainty that they never fully appreciated what they were walking away from. And listen to this, because this realization has changed the way they view the entire situation. Instead of asking why they feel regret, they are asking what the regret is trying to teach them. The answer is becoming impossible to ignore. The regret exists because the connection left a lasting impact. It influenced their growth. It shaped their perspective. It revealed parts of themselves they were not ready to face at the time. The feelings attached to it never completely disappeared because the experience itself never lost its significance. What surprises them most is that the regret is no longer making them feel trapped. In a strange way, it is creating freedom. For years, they carried the burden of defending a decision that no longer felt completely right. They constantly reminded themselves why they made the choice. They repeated the same explanations over and over. But now they are finally allowing themselves to acknowledge the truth without arguing against it. And that honesty is bringing a sense of peace they have not felt in a very long time. The emotional weight they have been carrying is becoming easier to understand. It was never about one single moment. It was never about one single decision. It was about what that decision revealed. It revealed fears they needed to overcome. It revealed lessons they needed to learn. It revealed how deeply the connection affected them. Most importantly, it revealed that some choices continue teaching us long after they are made. And listen to this, because this is why they cannot ignore the regret anymore. It is no longer just a feeling. It has become a message reminding them to be more honest with themselves, a message encouraging them to acknowledge what truly mattered, a message showing them that some of life's most important lessons arrive, disguised as things we wish we had understood sooner. The regret is not trying to punish them for the choice they made. It is trying to help them grow beyond it. Now they finally understand why these thoughts kept returning, why the memories never completely faded, and why the feeling refused to disappear. The regret remained because there was still wisdom hidden inside it. And once they stopped running from that truth, everything became clear. The choice they made about you was important because the connection was important. The lessons were important. The growth was important. And accepting that reality has given them something they spent a very long time searching for: understanding, acceptance, and the ability to finally see the situation for what it truly was.